On the evening of July 31st, 1995, Dana Satterfield was closing up her hair salon on Highway 221 in Roebuck, South Carolina. She was 27 years old, a mother of two, and the kind of stylist who never turned away a late customer. If someone called at 8 o'clock needing a haircut, Dana stayed. That night, staying cost Dana her life. What happened inside that salon should have been solved within days. A witness stood 30 feet away while it happened. She saw the killer's face. He left physical evidence behind him in the room. The town had barely 2,000 people, and everyone knew everyone. And yet the case sat unsolved for 10 years. I'll tell you up front, this case was solved. The man who killed Dana Satterfield is in a maximum security prison right now. But the way it broke open is unlike any case I've covered. No detective cracked it. No database matched it. A routine oil change solved it. Over the next 50 minutes, I'll show you how that's possible and what one man's silence cost. Hold on to three things: a water heater, a white and blue Ford Bronco, and a red Honda that got 2 oil changes in 1 month. This is True Crime Files documentary. Dana Chileen Satterfield was born on November 16, 1967, in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and she never really left the upstate. She grew up in a close, religious family, the kind that filled a church pew every Sunday. People who knew her reach for the same words when they describe her, even now, 30 years later: warm. Quick to laugh, the first to show up when somebody needed help. She married young, and by the early 1990s, she and her husband, Mike Satterfield, were raising 2 children, a daughter named Ashley and a son named Brandon. Mike ran a heating and air conditioning business. Dana worked odd jobs while the kids were small, and she saved. Because Dana had a dream, and it was a specific one. She didn't just want to do hair. She wanted her own chair, her own sign, her own front door. In Roebuck, a community of about 2,200 people just south of Spartanburg, she made it happen. The Roebuck Hair and Tanning Salon wasn't glamorous. It was a converted mobile trailer set just off Highway 221, behind a liquor store, close enough to the road that regulars could see her lights from their cars. Mike helped her build the place out. He handled the plumbing and the fixtures himself, and he personally installed the salon's hot water heater in the back room. Remember that water heater. It matters twice in this story, in 2 very different ways. The salon did well because Dana did not know how to say no. Monday through Friday, she'd open at 8 in the morning, and if a customer called at supper time asking whether she could squeeze them in, Dana squeezed them in. Some nights, she was still working at 9 or 10, sweeping up hair by lamplight while the liquor store next door closed and the highway went quiet. It wore on her. Anyone running a one-woman business while raising 2 kids knows exactly what that summer of 1995 felt like from the inside, the arithmetic of hours that never quite works. But the people who knew Dana say she never let a customer feel like a burden, because in her mind they weren't customers at all. Her clients weren't really clients. In a town that size, they were neighbors, church friends, the mothers of her kids' classmates. The salon was less a business than a front porch with better lighting. By the summer of 1995, there was strain at home. Dana and Mike had separated. They hadn't filed for divorce, and by every account the split was civil, even gentle. They shared the children. They still talked. People close to the couple said they were trying to find their way back to each other for Ashley and Brandon's sake. Ashley was 8 that summer. Brandon was 6. So that's the picture on the last day of July. A 27-year-old woman running her dream out of a trailer on a state highway. Working late again, alone, with the front door unlocked. Because in Roebuck, in 1995, nobody locked a door while the lights were still on. She had no way of knowing that someone had been watching that salon, someone who knew exactly how late she stayed. To understand what happened that night, you have to follow one woman's evening, almost minute by minute. Her name was Diane Harris. She sold cleaning products door to door, and July 31st had been a good day for her. Around 6:30 that evening, one of her stops was Dana's salon. Dana bought a bottle of cleaning fluid, and the two women hit it off. They talked for a while, two working mothers comparing notes, and then Diane moved on to her next stops. At 8:11 p.m., Diane passed the salon again. The lights were on. Through the front window, she could see Dana inside, tidying up, actually using the cleaning products she'd just bought. Dana looked up and waved. Diane waved back. Investigators would later lean hard on this timeline because it's astonishingly tight. Dana's appointment book showed her last scheduled client had come and gone hours before. At 8:11, she was alive, alone, cleaning up, waving through the glass. The 911 call went out around 8:45. Everything that happened to Dana Satterfield happened inside a window of barely half an hour, most of it inside the 19 minutes between a friendly wave and the sound of thumping in a dark building. Whoever came for her didn't linger and didn't hesitate. He arrived at closing time, when the last customer was long gone and the highway had emptied out, and detectives came to believe he knew that schedule because he'd made a point of learning it. Around 8:30, Diane came back to the front of the salon to wait for her ride home. And almost immediately, something felt wrong. The lights that had been on 19 minutes earlier were off. Then, from inside the dark building, she heard sounds. Dull, heavy thumps. Then a crash, loud enough to make her flinch. And then a man came out through the salon window. Not the door, the window. A young man in jeans and a light-colored shirt, moving fast. Diane ran. She bolted around one side of the building. He went around the other. And in one of the strangest details of this entire case, the two of them came face to face on the far side. For a second or two, no more. Diane Harris stood looking directly into the killer's face. Then, they both ran in opposite directions. Diane didn't have a cell phone. Almost nobody did in 1995. She raced toward the nearest people she could find, screaming for someone to call 911, and a call went out reporting what everyone assumed this was, a break-in at the little salon on Highway 221. A Spartanburg County Sheriff's deputy named J.T. Burnett happened to be close by. He pulled up to the salon just before 9, expecting the kind of call rural deputies handle every week. A jimmied lock, missing cash, paperwork. He walked into something else entirely. Inside, the salon at first looked almost normal. The deputy moved through the front room with his flashlight, past the chairs and the mirrors, and nothing seemed disturbed. The cash was still there. The equipment was still there. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't a robbery. Then he reached the back of the building, and he found Dana. I'm not going to walk you through that scene in detail, because Dana Satterfield was a mother and a daughter, and this channel doesn't trade in her suffering. What you need to know is this. She had been beaten. She had been strangled with a strap, and the other end of that strap had been tied to the hot water heater in the back room. The same water heater her husband had installed with his own hands when he helped her build her dream. Investigators would later confirm that she had also been sexually assaulted. Because Roebuck is Roebuck, the deputy recognized her immediately. Within the hour, the salon was a full crime scene. And from the very first walkthrough, detectives read this the same way you probably do. Nothing of value taken, a level of violence far beyond what any burglar caught by surprise would use. An attack in a small back room, on a woman who was minutes from going home to her children. This didn't look random. It looked personal. It looked like someone who came there for Dana. Crime scene technicians worked the trailer through the night for fingerprints, hair, and biological evidence, and they found things. That's what makes this case so maddening from the start. This was never an evidence problem. On the surface of that water heater, exactly where someone would have had to touch it to tie off the strap, they lifted a clear fingerprint. Elsewhere in the salon, they found a second print, and this one stopped everyone cold because it had been left in blood. Testing confirmed the blood was Dana's. Whoever left that print had touched her blood while it was fresh. While the technicians worked, deputies fanned out into the dark with the only description they had. They searched the streets and lots around Highway 221 for a young man on foot or a vehicle leaving in a hurry. They knocked on doors. They stopped cars. Nothing. A man had gone through a window in front of a witness in the middle of a small town, and inside of an hour he had simply dissolved. The autopsy confirmed the sexual assault, and it gave investigators the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case: the attacker's DNA. So take stock of what police had within 72 hours. An eyewitness who saw the killer's face, a fingerprint in the victim's blood, the killer's own DNA. In 2026, that case closes in a week. In 1995, it was about to go nowhere for 10 years. And the first reason why is that the fingerprint on the water heater came back with a name on it. The print on the water heater belonged to Mike Satterfield, Dana's husband. You can imagine what that did inside the sheriff's office. A murdered wife, a recent separation, his fingerprint inches from her body, on the very object the killer had used. In most homicide investigations, that's not a lead. That's a finish line. Detectives know the statistics as well as anyone. When a married woman is killed, the husband is the first name on the board for a reason. So they went at Mike hard, and piece by piece, the case against him came apart in their hands. Start with the night itself. Mike told detectives he'd been home with the children all evening. Ashley, 8 years old, and Brandon, 6, both said the same thing. Their dad never left the house. Children that young are hard witnesses to coach and harder to break, and neither one wavered. Then there was the man Diane Harris saw. She'd described someone young and lean, about 5'6" to 5'9", someone who had launched himself through a salon window and hit the ground running. Mike Satterfield was a big man. Detectives looked at him, looked at that window, and struggled to believe he could have gotten through it at all, let alone at speed. Then the fingerprint itself. Mike had an explanation, and it was the simplest one imaginable. Of course his print was on the water heater. He installed it. He'd repaired it since, along with half of everything else in that trailer, because even separated, he was still the man Dana called when something in the salon broke. The print wasn't in blood. It was exactly where an installer's hand would rest. Detectives kept pushing. They asked around about the marriage, and everyone, Dana's family included, told the same story. Yes, they'd separated. No, it wasn't ugly. They were on decent terms, still raising the kids together, still hoping to fix it. Investigators even ran down the coldest version of the theory, that Mike had hired someone and found nothing to support it. A hired killing doesn't look like that back room looked. Contract killers don't leave rage on a body. Mike agreed to a polygraph. The examiner found no deception. And that second fingerprint, the one in Dana's blood, didn't match Mike. It didn't match anyone. Detectives ran it against every person in Dana's orbit, every name in her appointment book, and got nothing. It sat in the file, a killer's signature, written in his victim's blood, with no database in the world able to put a name to it. Which meant the town of Roebuck was left with the worst possible answer. The person who did this wasn't the husband. It was the man from the window, and nobody, in a town where everybody knew everybody, had ever seen him before. Diane Harris sat with a police artist and built a face. Young, white, somewhere between 18 and 25, slim, roughly 5'6" to 5'9", jeans and a light shirt. The sketch went up all over Spartanburg County, in store windows and church bulletins, on the local news. And here's what should have ended this case in a week. Diane Harris was not some passing stranger. Selling door to door was her living. She walked this exact area constantly. New shopkeepers, new regulars, new faces the way a mail carrier knows them. And she had never seen this man in her life. In a community of 2,200 people, that told detectives something chilling. Either the killer was an outsider, or he was local and simply young enough, quiet enough, invisible enough to have never crossed her path. There was one more thread. That same evening, a driver who knew Dana passed the salon and noticed a vehicle pulled onto the shoulder of Highway 221 nearby. A white and blue Ford Bronco with a young man near it who looked agitated. In the working profile investigators built, that truck grew specific. They came to believe the man they wanted drove a blue Ford Bronco with custom rims, and the description went out alongside the sketch. There's the second object I asked you to hold on to. The Bronco. Detectives chased it. They combed Roebuck and the surrounding area for white and blue Broncos, and they found one registered to a woman named Mary Ann Vick, who was, in the way of small towns, one of Dana's own customers. Officers looked at the vehicle. The witness said it was close, but he couldn't call it a perfect match to the one he'd seen. And Mary Ann had a teenage son, Jonathan, 17 years old, who had been to the salon before, because Dana was the one who cut his hair. Police spoke with the boy in those early days. 17, no record to speak of, a local kid whose mother sat in Dana's chair. Whatever was said in that conversation, it wasn't enough. He was one name among hundreds, and the investigation moved past him. I want to be careful here, because hindsight makes everyone a genius. Detectives in 1995 interviewed enormous numbers of people. They worked through Dana's appointment book, client by client, and since her clients were effectively the whole town, that meant months of sit-downs with customers, their husbands, their sons, anyone whose name touched that trailer. Thousands of leads went into that file over the years, phoned in, mailed in, whispered at gas pumps. The composite was a face with no name. The Bronco was a maybe. A quiet 17-year-old with a haircut appointment history was nothing that stood out from 100 other maybes. But sit with the shape of it. By the fall of 1995, the man who killed Dana Satterfield had already been inside a sheriff's department interview. His mother's truck had already been looked at. His face had already been seen, up close, by a witness who would never forget it. Every piece was on the table, and the case was about to freeze solid anyway, because of what the year was. Here's the part of this story that people under 40 have genuine trouble believing. Police had the killer's DNA in August of 1995, and there was almost nothing they could do with it. Today, an unknown offender profile goes into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index, and gets searched against millions of convicted offenders and crime scene samples across the country, automatically, continuously. If your man is in the system, you know it fast. In the summer of 1995, that system did not functionally exist. Congress had authorized a national DNA index, and pilot programs were being stitched together state by state. But CODIS didn't come online as a truly national searchable network until October of 1998, 3 years too late for Dana. And even then, a database is only as good as what's in it. It took years more for states to work through the backlog of collecting samples from convicted offenders. And a 17-year-old with no felony record, which is what Dana's killer was in 1995, wouldn't have been in any offender index anyway. What South Carolina investigators had that summer was a genetic profile of the killer and nowhere to send it. No index, no offender pool, no cold hits. So they did the only thing available, and it sounds almost medieval now. They collected DNA from potential suspects one man at a time, by consent or by warrant, and compared each sample against the profile. One tube of blood, one lab cycle, One answer, weeks per name. Detectives worked through Dana's world that way for months. Clients' husbands, local men who resembled the sketch, anyone the tip line coughed up. Every single comparison came back the same way. Not him, not him, not him. Understand what that meant for the family. Every few weeks, another name, another wait, another no. Ashley turned 9, then 10, then 13, learning to answer the question every child of an unsolved murder learns to answer, the one that starts with whatever happened with your mom. Brandon started school without his mother at the door. Mike, cleared but never untouched by it, raised 2 children inside a town that had watched him be a suspect, and in a place that small, being cleared and being forgotten are 2 different things. The salon on Highway 221 sat there the whole time, a building everyone drove past and nobody could look at. And the file, thick with evidence that would have solved the case in any later decade, went from active to cooling to cold. The DNA was the lock, and the key was walking around Spartanburg County the whole time. The system just had no way to bring them together, unless, of course, someone simply told police who he was. And here is where this case turns from tragedy into something closer to heartbreak, because someone knew, someone had known since the morning after. And before we get to him, you need to see how badly this investigation could be led astray in the meantime, because in the late 90s, detectives thought they finally had their man. They were wrong. A couple of years into the cold stretch, a tip came from inside a prison. An inmate told investigators that his cellmate, a man named Russell Quinn, was carrying something strange, a picture of Dana Satterfield. And according to the tipster, Quinn talked about the case like a man who'd been there. Jailhouse tips are cheap currency. Inmates trade information, real and invented, for consideration, and every detective knows it, so investigators treated it with suspicion. But you cannot ignore a man allegedly carrying the victim's photograph. Then came the moment that seemed to change everything. Police assembled a photo array and brought it to the one person who had looked the killer in the face. Diane Harris studied the pictures. She picked Russell Quinn. Think about where the investigation stood in that moment. A tip, a photograph of the victim in a stranger's possession, and now an eyewitness identification from a credible, sober witness with no agenda. Careers have been built, and men have been executed on thinner cases than that. If this murder had gone to trial on those 3 pieces, a Spartanburg County jury might well have convicted Russell Quinn. The DNA said no. When Quinn's sample was compared against the profile from the crime scene, it didn't match. Whatever the truth of the photo and the talk, science excluded him as the man who left that evidence, and the case against him evaporated. Pause on this with me, because it's one of the most important lessons this case has to teach. Diane Harris was not lying, and she was not foolish. She was a good witness, doing her honest best. But human memory is not a photograph. It's a story the brain rebuilds every time it's told, and a face glimpsed for 2 terrified seconds in the dark, years earlier, is exactly the kind of memory that bends. Decades of research and hundreds of DNA exonerations have shown that confident, sincere eyewitnesses pick the wrong man far more often than any of us want to believe. The Satterfield case came within one lab report of becoming that story. Instead, the DNA that couldn't yet catch the guilty man quietly saved an innocent one. And so the file went back on the shelf. The 90s ended. The salon on Highway 221 stood empty, and in all that silence, a young man in Spartanburg County was living with a secret that was eating him alive and picking up a telephone he could never quite speak into. His name was Michael Pace, David Michael Pace, on the court records. In 1995, he was a teenager working at a local bowling alley. One of the guys who came by to hang around his counter a couple of times a month was a high school friend of his, a 17-year-old named Jonathan Vick. On the evening of Monday, July 31st, 1995, Vick showed up at the bowling alley, and the two of them talked for close to an hour. And Vick wanted to talk about one subject, a hairdresser named Dana. He'd mentioned her before, the pretty stylist who cut his hair. But that night was different. That night, Vick told Pace that Dana was having trouble in her marriage and that he was going to ask her out. Tonight. Pace laughed at him. Dana was 27, a married mother of 2. Vick was 17. It was absurd on its face, and Pace treated it that way. Vick did not laugh. He got angry, defensive. He kept insisting he had a real chance with her, and he talked about her in terms crude enough that I won't repeat them here. This wasn't a crush he was describing. Then he gave Pace a ride home, still stewing over being mocked, and as Pace got out of the car, Vick told him where he was headed, to get his hair cut. Pace asked the obvious question, "Who cuts hair this late at night?" "Dana does," Vick said. "She keeps the salon open late. She knows I'm coming." The next day, the news broke that Dana Satterfield had been murdered in her salon the night before, in exactly the window of time after Vick drove away. Pace didn't want to believe it. This was his friend, a kid he shot pool and killed time with. Then police announced they were looking for a white Ford Bronco, and the floor dropped out of Michael Pace's denial because he had ridden home in Marianne Vick's white and blue Bronco that very night. Days later, Vick found Pace at a pool hall and made things simple. If Pace ever told anyone about that night, Vick would kill him. Now, it's easy to sit in judgment of what happened next, or rather, what didn't. But Michael Pace did not simply swallow it and walk away. Over the following decade, he called law enforcement about Jonathan Vick not once, but 3 times, anonymously. He'd say there was a name they needed to look at for the Satterfield murder, and he would not say who he was because he believed the man he was naming was capable of killing him. And here the system failed, in a way worth understanding plainly, because a lot of viewers ask the same question at this point in the story. Police had a name. Why couldn't they just test him? The answer is the Fourth Amendment, and it isn't a technicality. Taking a man's blood or his fingerprints against his will is a search, and a search needs a warrant, and a warrant needs probable cause a judge will sign off on. An anonymous voice on a phone line is not probable cause. It can't be cross-examined, can't be assessed for motive, can't be held to account if it's a grudge or a prank. Courts have held that line for good reason, because a world where an unnamed caller can send the state after any citizen's body is a world none of us would want to live in. The same rule that protected Jonathan Vick for a decade protects every innocent person watching this. A judge cannot sign that warrant on the word of a caller who won't give a name, won't make a statement, won't stand behind the accusation. When investigators did try to move on the tip in the mid-90s, a judge refused the warrant for exactly that reason. When officers approached the family, Marianne Vick shut it down cold, insisting her son had nothing to do with it and demanding they leave her family alone. Without a named witness, that was checkmate. So the tips died in the file. Pace assumed police had checked Vick out and cleared him. Police had a ghost tip they legally couldn't act on, and Jonathan Vick walked around free, while the one living witness to his stated intentions kept making anonymous calls from the edge of his own fear. 10 years. That's how long the standoff held. What finally broke it wasn't a detective, a database, or a deathbed confession. It was a red Honda, a quart of motor oil, and a question asked across a garage bay. By 2005, Michael Pace was 27 years old, the same age Dana had been. He was married, a father now himself, working as a mechanic at an express lube in Spartanburg County. The murder was 10 years cold, Roebuck had a new generation of kids who'd never heard Dana's name. That year, Spartanburg County also swore in a new sheriff, Chuck Wright, who arrived with a philosophy he repeated to anyone who'd listen: there are no cold cases, only old ones. He put the photographs of the county's unsolved murder victims up at the front of his office, where his people would walk past them every single day. No deputy could clock in without meeting the eyes of the families the county still owed. Dana Satterfield's face was on that wall. It's a small thing, a wall of photographs, and there's no way to measure what it changed, but it meant that when the break finally came, it landed in a department that had already decided Dana's case was open. One day at the shop, Pace noticed something that mechanics notice: a young woman in a red Honda coming through for an oil change twice in the same month. Nobody changes their oil twice in a month. It was garage small talk, nothing more. He mentioned it to a coworker. "Who is that?" The coworker knew. "That's Ashley," he said. "Dana Satterfield's daughter." Michael Pace hadn't known Dana Satterfield had children. For 10 years, he had carried this thing as a story about himself, his fear, his friend, his phone calls, his cover. And now the abstraction was standing in his garage. The 8-year-old who'd been waiting at home for her mother that night was a grown woman now, with her mother's face, driving in for oil changes. Living an entire life inside the hole his silence had helped keep open. Pace would later explain it in the plainest terms a man can use. He was a father himself now. He knew what he had to do to get that family their answers, whatever it took. Ashley Satterfield had no idea any of this was happening. She got her oil changed and drove away. She would only learn much later that walking into that shop had done what 10 years of police work couldn't. Pace went to his boss first, and then he went to the sheriff's office. He gave them the same name he'd given anonymously 3 times before. But this time, when they told him an unsigned voice wasn't enough, he didn't hang up. He gave his name. He sat down. He put every word of July 31st, 1995 into a signed, sworn statement. The bowling alley, the obsession, the Bronco, the haircut that wasn't a haircut, and the death threat that had bought his silence for a decade. And with a named, sworn witness on paper, everything that had been legally impossible for 10 years became possible in days. A judge signed the order. Jonathan Vick, now 28, married with a young daughter and living up the road in Greenville, was about to give the state of South Carolina a DNA sample whether he liked it or not. Before you see what that swab revealed, one honest sentence: most of you watching aren't subscribed, and a case like this takes weeks to verify against court records before I write a word. If this channel earns a place in your week, subscribing is how these stories keep getting made. That's it. That's the whole ask. Because what the lab found didn't just close Dana's case, it opened another one. While the sample was at the lab, detectives built out the man Jonathan Vick had become in the missing decade, and the picture was ugly in a quiet, consistent way. After high school, he joined the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps had thrown him out, a general discharge after 2 separate assault convictions during his service, one against a man, one against a woman. As a civilian back in South Carolina, he'd been arrested twice more, once for vandalism, once for domestic violence, with the charges dropped both times. Back home, he'd built the outward shape of an ordinary life. By 2005, he was 28, married with a young daughter, living in Greenville about half an hour up the road from the salon where Dana died. But the ordinary life kept springing leaks. He couldn't hold a job, and the reason was always the same: conflicts with coworkers, blow-ups at supervisors, a temper that ended every employment the same way, and a flat refusal to be told anything by anyone. And then there was what a former girlfriend told investigators. She said that Vic, driving past the salon where Dana died, had warned her that if she didn't do what he said, she would end up like that woman. Sit with that. For 10 years, while the file gathered dust, the man who killed Dana Satterfield was allegedly using her as a threat. Then the lab called. The DNA recovered from Dana's body in 1995 matched Jonathan Vick. The odds of the profile belonging to someone else were calculated at roughly 900 million to 1. The 17-year-old detectives had spoken to and released in the first days of the investigation, the son of the woman whose Bronco they'd examined. The quiet local kid nobody could pick out of the town's 2,000 faces. He had been the answer sitting in the file since week 1. In October 2005, deputies arrested Vic for the murder of Dana Satterfield. Walked past the cameras. He didn't protest his innocence to the reporters. What he said was that he loved his wife and daughter, and that was all that mattered. In the interview room, he denied everything, including, remarkably, ever having known Dana at all. The woman who had cut his hair, the woman his own mother sat with, the woman he had described to Michael Pace, by name, an hour before she died. The denials didn't matter anymore. For Roebuck, the arrest landed with a particular kind of vertigo. The monster the town had imagined for 10 years, the drifting outsider from the composite sketch, had never existed. The answer was a name off a local church roll, a boy whose mother sat in the victim's chair. Someone who had stood in that salon making small talk while Dana worked around his ears with her scissors. Every safety story a small town tells itself, that we know our own, that evil arrives from somewhere else, died in Spartanburg County the day that Mugshot ran. But before we get to the courtroom, I have to show you what else detectives found when they pulled every thread of Jonathan Vick's missing decade. Because in 2002, 3 years before this arrest, a 20-year-old woman in Spartanburg had vanished off the face of the earth. Her name was Heather Sellers, and the last person known to have seen her alive was Jonathan Vick. Hold Heather's name. We're coming back to her, because her story isn't a footnote to Dana's. It may be the second chapter of the same one. First, though, Dana's family had waited 11 years for a courtroom, and what happened inside it took a jury less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. And this is where I want to hear from you, because I've gone back and forth on it myself. Michael Pace stayed silent for 10 years under a genuine death threat from a man who, we now know, was exactly as dangerous as Pace feared. Was his silence understandable or unforgivable? Put your honest answer in the comments. I'll ask you again at the end, and I genuinely don't think there's an easy answer. The trial opened in November 2006, 11 years and change after the murder. The prosecution was led by Spartanburg County Solicitor Trey Gowdy, a name many of you will recognize, because Gowdy went on to serve in the United States Congress. He has said that convicting Dana's killer stands among the most satisfying moments of his legal career. In front of Judge Durham Cole, over 4 days of testimony, the state assembled 11 years of grief into a single, methodical case. Mike Satterfield went first. He described the last normal evening, dinner and television with Dana and the kids, despite the separation, an ordinary family night that turned out to be a goodbye. When the questions reached the night she died, Mike broke down on the stand and couldn't go on. The judge had to call a recess. Diane Harris testified, 11 years after those 2 seconds by the salon, about the man who came through the window and met her face-to-face in the dark. Michael Pace testified under his own name in open court, with Vic watching him, about the bowling alley, the obsession, and the threat. And then came a witness nobody outside the case saw coming, a man named Steve Vaughn, who had shared a cell with Vic while he awaited trial. Vaughn told the jury about a conversation the two of them had, the kind men have in cells at night. He'd asked Vic whether there was any day of his life he would take back if he could. Yes, Vic said, the day he went to Mrs. Satterfield's salon. He'd said more, according to Vaughn. that he had parked the Bronco across the street that night, away from the salon, because Dana was married and he didn't want her husband to see his vehicle there. Think about what that detail means. It's not the slip of an innocent man. It's planning, concealment before the crime by someone who understood that what he intended needed hiding. The defense did what it could, pointing to a hair from the scene that didn't match Vic. The state answered with the location where Dana was found and the simple fact of a salon's foot traffic. Against a 900 million to 1 DNA match, an eyewitness, a sworn account of his stated intentions that night, and his own words from a jail cell, there was nowhere for the defense to stand. On November 30th, 2006, the case went to the jury, and the jury barely needed it. They were back in roughly 20 minutes, one of the shortest murder deliberations anyone in Spartanburg County could remember, with guilty verdicts across the board: murder, kidnapping, criminal sexual conduct. Prosecutors read the speed itself as a message about how the community judged what he'd done. Vic wept as the verdict was read, and even then he gave them nothing. He stood before the judge and insisted the real killer was still free, that Dana had gotten no justice that day. Because he was 17 at the time of the crime, the death penalty was off the table. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murder, with 30 more years for the sexual assault. An appeals court later trimmed the sentencing on technical grounds, vacating the kidnapping term, but it affirmed every conviction and left the life sentence untouched. With the verdict in, investigators could finally say out loud what they believed happened inside that trailer on July 31st, 1995, and the reconstruction is all the more disturbing for how mundane it starts. Vic drove to the salon at closing time, exactly as he'd told Michael Pace he would, and he parked across the street so the truck couldn't be tied to his visit. The haircut was the pretext that got him through the door of a business where he was a known face, the son of a customer. At some point after Diane Harris saw Dana wave at 811, he made his move, and Dana, one way or another, said no. The lights went out. The front door was secured from inside. What followed took only minutes. One question survived even the conviction, and detectives have turned it over ever since. Why the window? He could have unlocked the front door and walked out into the dark like anyone leaving late. Instead, he crashed out through the glass, and that single panicked choice is the entire reason this case was ever solvable, because it's what made Diane Harris look up. His cellmate's account offers the only answer we'll likely ever get, that by the end, he was simply badly scared. The planning got him in quietly. Nothing about him was calm on the way out. If he had walked out that door like a customer, there is a real chance no witness ever sees his face, no sketch ever goes up, and the Bronco never enters the file. Prison did not soften him. While in custody, he attacked a detention officer, a corporal, an assault that was caught on video and earned him 3 additional years. He becomes eligible to apply for parole in 2035, when he'll be 57, and a record like his walks into that hearing room ahead of him. Dana's case was closed. Her killer will very likely die in the Lieber Correctional Institution, and if this were a movie, it would end here. It doesn't end here. September 24th, 2002. 3 years before Vic's arrest, 7 years after Dana's murder. That afternoon, a 20-year-old woman named Heather Sellers was dropped off at her job, the Waffle House near Highway 9 and Interstate 85 in Spartanburg, by her grandmother. She was carrying a bag with her work uniform and a change of clothes, because the plan was simple and ordinary. Work the shift, then spend the night at her aunt's house. She finished the shift. She made it to her aunt's. Heather had been engaged to Jonathan Vick. 2 weeks earlier, she had broken it off, though the two were still seeing each other. Her family would later say the relationship had been abusive, that Heather had told them about it more than once, though she never filed a report. 2 weeks out of a broken engagement with a man like that, still tangled up with him, still young enough to believe she could manage him. That evening, Vic came by her aunt's place and picked her up. The two of them went out drinking at a pair of local bars, ending at a lounge called Cocktails and Dreams on Whitney Road. No one has ever seen Heather Sellers again. Vic's account, given to her family, was that he dropped her off at the club and drove away. She never came back for her final paycheck, $81, still sitting at the Waffle House. For a young woman scraping by, that alone told her family everything. Heather didn't run. Something happened to her. No one could ever corroborate that account. He was, by every record, the last known person to see her, and he has been the central figure in the case ever since. He has never been charged. And when Dana's case broke open in 2005 and 2006, one more discovery landed like a stone. Investigators located an abandoned vehicle registered to Vic, and inside it they found bloodstains and blonde hair. Heather was blonde. The material was too degraded for the testing of that era to give a definitive answer, and the question it raised has hung in the air for 20 years. Let me be precise here, because precision is what Heather is owed. Jonathan Vick is a suspect in her disappearance, named as such by investigators, and he has refused to cooperate with them from prison. That is what's known. No one has proven what happened to Heather, and this channel won't pretend otherwise. But her case is not closed, and it is not forgotten. Just this spring, in May of 2026, the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit publicly renewed its appeal in Heather's case. Investigators said plainly that someone out there holds a detail they may not even realize matters. If that someone is watching, the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit is waiting, and this case has already proven, once, exactly what a single person deciding to speak can do. Dana's story shows how that ends when the silence finally breaks. Heather's family is still waiting for their oil change. So what do you do with a childhood like Ashley's? 8 years old when her mother was taken, 18 when her own face, her mother's face looking back out of it, moved a stranger in a garage to finally tell the truth. She solved her mother's murder by getting an oil change, and she didn't know it for months. Here's what she did with it. Ashley grew up to become a victim's advocate with the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office. She sits with families in the worst hours of their lives, walking them through the same fog she once walked through as a little girl. She built a program inside the jail that puts inmates face to face with what violent crime does to the families left behind. She has said that forgiveness, if it ever comes, waits on the day Jonathan Vick admits what he did, and she once put the whole weight of it into one line: you don't get over it. You just learn how to live with it. Dana Satterfield spent her life making a small, warm room where her town felt welcome, and the people she made, her daughter most of all, turned her loss into shelter for other families. That's the ending Dana's killer doesn't get to touch. Before you go, 3 things, quickly. First, the question I promised to ask again: Michael Pace's 10 years of silence under a real death threat from a proven killer, understandable or unforgivable? The comments are open, and I read them. Second, the like button costs you nothing, and it helps Dana's story and Heather's name reach people who have never heard either one. Give it that much. And third, Heather Sellers deserves more than 3 minutes at the end of someone else's story. Her full case, the timeline, the bars, the vehicle, and where the investigation stands right now is the next video, and it's on your screen at this moment. I'll see you there.